The planet Joreth was a wasteland of ash and fire. Once a lush world of towering crystal forests and shimmering rivers, it had been torn apart by years of war between humanity and the enigmatic Shalvaris. Corporal Elias Vance crouched low behind a crumbling rock formation, his breathing steady despite the chaos around him. His unit had been ambushed hours ago, and now he was alone, lost in enemy territory. His comlink was dead, his supplies running low, and his chances of survival seemed slim. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle as distant explosions rumbled across the horizon. The sky above him was a swirling mix of orange and gray, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. He moved cautiously, scanning for any signs of movement. The Shalvaris were known for their stealth and advanced technology, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he rounded a jagged outcrop of rock, something caught his eye, a faint shimmer of light reflecting off metal. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, but curiosity drove him forward. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Lying crumpled on the ground was a Shalvaris woman, her silver-blue armor scorched and cracked. Her pale, almost luminescent skin was marred with cuts, and a deep wound on her side bled a strange iridescent liquid that glowed faintly. She was still alive, though barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and her dark eyes fluttered open for a brief moment before closing again. Elias hesitated. The Shalvaris were humanity's enemy, a species that had waged war against them for decades. They were brilliant, advanced, and coldly efficient, but they were also ruthless. And yet, looking at her now, vulnerable and injured, she seemed almost fragile. He knelt beside her, his military training and basic humanity warring within him. "What am I doing?" he muttered under his breath. His medkit AI chimed in his helmet. "Warning. Subject is Shalvaris. Medical assistance not recommended." He ignored it. "She's dying," he whispered. "I can't just leave her." The AI paused, then offered, "Shalvaris biological systems are not fully compatible with human medicine. Attempting treatment poses significant risk." Elias clenched his jaw. The wound on her side was deep, and she was losing blood, if it could even be called that, at an alarming rate. He rummaged through his medkit and pulled out a bioscan device. The scan confirmed his fears. Her species' unique blood chemistry meant no standard treatment would work. Except one. Crazy idea, he muttered to himself, biting his lip as he considered the consequences. Shalvaris biology was mysterious, but his scan showed a faint possibility that his own blood might sustain her long enough for her body to recover. "Potential toxicity levels are high," the AI warned. "This procedure is highly unorthodox." "Yeah, I got that," Elias said, already setting up the transfusion kit. "But if I don't try, she's dead anyway." The process was painful. His body protested as the kit extracted his blood and infused it into hers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, her breathing steadied, and the faint glow of her blood began to brighten. Elias leaned back, exhausted but relieved. The Shalvaris woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open once more. This time, she focused on him, her gaze filled with confusion and something he couldn't quite place. "You?" she whispered weakly, her voice like a soft hum. "Why?" Elias shrugged, his voice low. "Because someone had to." The distant rumble of enemy forces reminded him their safety was temporary. But for now, he'd saved a life, even if it was the life of his so-called enemy. Elias barely had time to catch his breath before the sound of distant engines reached his ears. The low, humming growl of enemy patrols echoed through the canyon, and his heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked around, searching for a place to hide. But the landscape was a barren stretch of rocks and dust. The Shalvaris woman stirred again, groaning as she tried to sit up. Her silver-blue armor clinked softly, and her eyes fluttered open. Elias rushed to her side, careful not to startle her. "Easy," he said, holding her steady. "You're still weak. You can't move yet." Her eyes locked onto his with a confused expression, and she swallowed hard, trying to speak. "You gave me your blood." Elias nodded, trying to keep his voice calm. "I didn't have much of a choice. You were dying. I couldn't just leave you like that." Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but the effort made her wince in pain. Instead, she fell silent, her gaze distant. Elias could see the battle raging inside her, confusion, anger, and disbelief all mixed together. The Shalvaris were a proud species, and their warriors were trained to fight without mercy. Yet here she was, a warrior who owed her life to a human. Elias's hand shook slightly as he checked his medkit. He had done everything he could, but now he wasn't sure if his decision had been a good one. The AI in his helmet chimed in again, its calm voice the only thing offering reassurance. "Warning. Subject's blood chemistry is incompatible with human biology. Risk of contamination and adverse reactions is high. Further transfusions are not recommended." "I'm aware," Elias muttered. The AI wasn't telling him anything he didn't already know. His own blood coursing through her veins felt like an impossible, dangerous gamble. But so far, it seemed to be working. She hadn't gone into shock, and the bleeding had slowed considerably. He focused on the immediate problem. They needed to move. The patrols were getting closer, and they had no time to waste. Elias gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her as she shifted her weight to one side. "We need to get you out of here," he said firmly. "Can you stand?" The Shalvaris woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. With Elias's help, she struggled to her feet, her knees unsteady at first, but she found her balance. Elias could see the effort it took for her to remain upright, but there was something in her eyes now, a silent strength, an acknowledgement of the unlikely bond between them. "I'll need to move slowly," she murmured, her voice still weak. "I need rest." "You'll get it when we're safe," Elias said, glancing over his shoulder. The patrol was closer now, their engines thrumming loudly as they scoured the area. There was no time to waste. They started moving, the woman's steps unsteady at first, but she managed to stay on her feet. Elias kept a protective distance between them and the approaching patrol, crouching low as they moved through the rocky terrain. His mind raced, calculating their next steps. They had to find cover, and fast. After several minutes, they reached a narrow crevice in the rocks, a small gap barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Elias ushered the woman inside, pulling her gently by the arm. They crouched together, hidden from view. "Stay here," Elias whispered, glancing at her one last time before slipping out of the crevice to scout. He moved quickly, staying low to the ground, his eyes darting back and forth. The patrol was now right above them, their figures outlined in the dim light. Elias could hear them talking in their strange, musical language, but he didn't need to understand it to know they were searching for something or someone. He crouched, holding his breath as a Shalvaris soldier passed within a few feet of his position. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remained still, praying they wouldn't notice him. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the patrol moved on, their engines fading into the distance. Elias let out a quiet sigh of relief and returned to the crevice. "It's clear," he said to the woman, helping her back to her feet. "We need to keep moving." Her eyes met his, a strange look crossing her face. She wasn't sure how to thank him. How could she, when everything she knew about her people told her that kindness from an enemy was weakness? But for now, there was only one thing they could agree on: survival, and maybe, just maybe, a new kind of understanding between their species. Elias helped the Shalvaris woman move deeper into the rocky shelter they had found. Her steps were still unsteady, but her strength was slowly returning. Every few minutes, she would pause, lean against the jagged rocks, and catch her breath, but she wasn't complaining. Elias could see the fierce determination in her eyes. "Can you make it to the next ridge?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He didn't want to rush her, but they were running out of time. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. She nodded, though it was clear the effort cost her. The pain from the wound on her side was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as before. Elias wasn't sure if it was his blood helping or just the natural healing process of her alien body, but he wasn't going to take any chances. "I'll make it," she said quietly, her voice still weak but firm. Elias studied her carefully. Her silver-blue skin had regained some of its usual glow, and the faint light in her blood had faded to a normal hue. She was looking at him now, her expression unreadable. It was strange, seeing her like this, vulnerable, injured. He had expected her to be hostile, cold, or at least cautious. After all, humans and Chalveris didn't mix well. They were enemies, and their races had been at war for years. But here she was, accepting his help in the most unexpected of ways. "You're quiet," Elias said after a few moments, breaking the silence. "Don't tell me Chalveris warriors aren't allowed to talk." She glanced at him, the corners of her lips twitching as though she might smile, but the effort was too much. She quickly turned her eyes back to the rocky path ahead. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know why you did it. You gave me your blood." Her gaze flickered to him, her confusion obvious. "Why?" Elias paused, considering her words. Why had he done it? He could have left her. He could have just kept moving, let her die, and no one would have ever known. But something inside him had pushed him to help. "You were dying," he said simply. "What else could I do?" She was silent for a moment, and Elias could tell she was struggling to understand. The Chalveris were known for their cold logic, their ability to make decisions based on reason alone. Emotion didn't play a part in their decisions. But now, this woman, this warrior, was faced with an act of kindness she couldn't explain. "You gave me a part of yourself," she said, the words slowly sinking in. Her voice was full of wonder. "You risked your life for mine." Elias shrugged, trying to keep things casual. It's what anyone would do. He didn't feel like explaining that for him. It had never been a choice. It had felt like the right thing to do in that moment, nothing more. She looked at him again, this time with a hint of something new in her eyes, something softer, almost like respect. "Not anyone," she said quietly. "Only a few." Elias felt a strange sense of satisfaction, even though he knew they were still far from out of danger. But in that brief exchange, something had shifted between them. The divide between human and Chalveris, the years of hatred and distrust, had begun to feel less insurmountable. The Chalveris woman stopped for a moment, her expression turning more serious. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "My name is Siren," she said, her voice stronger now. Elias raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift. "Siren," he repeated. "Nice to meet you, Siren. I'm Elias." For a moment, the two of them stood there, caught in an awkward silence. It wasn't like they could just forget everything that had happened, that their people were at war. But Elias couldn't deny the quiet connection forming between them. It was a connection based on survival, yes, but also on something deeper. A shared moment in the middle of a battlefield, where human and Chalveris alike were nothing more than two souls trying to make it out alive. Siren looked at him, her face more serious now, as though she was considering something. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low but urgent. "I have to warn you," she said, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The blood you gave me, it's not just an accident. It's connected to something much bigger, something my people won't like." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" Siren hesitated, glancing around as though she might be overheard, then leaned closer to him. "I'm carrying something," she whispered. "A secret, a piece of information that could change everything. But it's dangerous, Elias. It's dangerous for both of us." Elias didn't have time to process everything she said. The wind shifted, and the sound of engines rumbled in the distance again. They had no time to waste. "Let's talk later," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "For now, We need to get out of here. Elias and Saren moved swiftly through the rocky landscape, the urgency of their situation pressing down on them with every step. The distant sound of enemy patrols grew louder, and Elias could feel the weight of their time running out. They needed to find cover, and fast. Saren, despite her weakened state, was surprisingly agile. Her alien physiology allowed her to move silently, her steps light but purposeful. Elias kept pace beside her, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The last thing they needed was to be caught by the Shalvaris forces who were undoubtedly searching for her. "You're holding up better than I thought," Elias muttered, glancing at her. Saren's face remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps pride or determination, in her eyes. "I've been trained for worse," she replied, her voice steady, but tinged with the faintest edge of exhaustion. Elias didn't doubt it. The Shalvaris were formidable warriors, known for their tactical genius and unyielding endurance. Yet, despite their differences, something about the way they moved together now felt strangely in sync, as though they had been partners in this fight for far longer than a few short hours. "Stay close," Elias said, his voice lowering. "We're nearing the enemy's main camp. We have to stay low." Saren nodded, understanding the importance of stealth. Elias led the way as they navigated through narrow canyons, avoiding the open paths where they would be easy targets. His instincts were sharp, the training from countless missions guiding his every move. But this was different. He wasn't just protecting himself now. He was protecting Saren, a member of the enemy species, who had once been an opponent, but was now someone he had sworn to help. They reached a narrow ridge, the rocks jagged and uneven. Elias motioned for Saren to climb up first, using the natural cover of the rocks to hide them from any patrols that might be passing below. Saren moved with surprising grace despite her injuries, her silver-blue skin blending with the surroundings. She reached the top and crouched low, signaling Elias to follow. Elias scaled the rocks quickly, his heart pounding in his chest as he pulled himself up beside her. They lay flat against the cool stone, peering over the edge of the ridge to see the enemy camp spread out below them. It was well guarded, the Shalvaris soldiers moving in calculated patterns, their sharp eyes scanning the area for any sign of intruders. "Too many of them," Elias whispered, frowning. "We can't go through there." Saren glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're right, but we don't have much of a choice. We need to get to the transmission relay on the other side of their camp." Elias shook his head. "That's suicide. There's no way we'll make it past all those guards." "I've made it past worse," Saren replied, her voice calm but resolute. She looked at him, her expression softening. "But I need your help. I can't do this alone." Elias hesitated, his mind racing. The risks were enormous. If they were caught, both of them would be dead before they could explain anything. But something in Saren's voice made him pause. It wasn't just the need to survive. It was the trust she had placed in him. She had no reason to rely on him, a human, yet she was. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice firm. "We'll make it work, but we need a distraction." Saren nodded. "I've got something in mind." She reached into a compartment on her armor and pulled out a small device. Elias recognized it immediately. A Shalvaris disruptor, a tool used for disabling enemy communications and equipment. Saren activated the device, and the world around them suddenly grew silent. The Shalvaris communication signals scrambled, creating a perfect opportunity for them to move undetected. "Now," Saren whispered, "we move." They carefully descended the ridge, staying low to the ground as they made their way toward the camp. The disruption would buy them a few minutes, but it wouldn't last long. Elias's heart raced as they snuck past the first guard post, the sound of their footsteps barely audible against the wind. He kept his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. They were close now, so close to the transmission relay. Elias could almost hear the hum of the equipment. He could feel the tension building between them as they neared the heart of the enemy's stronghold. His mind was split between the mission, helping Saren transmit the data, and the overwhelming fear of being discovered. But just as they reached the relay's control center, a sound echoed through the air, an unmistakable thud, the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. Saren froze, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. "Someone's coming," Saren whispered urgently. Elias didn't have time to think. He grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadows of a nearby outcropping. He held his breath, waiting for the approaching footsteps to pass. The seconds felt like hours as the chivalrous guard moved closer, unaware of the two intruders hiding just yards away. Elias could feel the sweat on his palms, his mind racing with every possible outcome. If they were caught now, they wouldn't have a chance. The guard stopped just a few feet away, his footsteps faltering for a moment. But after a long, tense pause, he continued on his patrol, unaware of the danger that had almost been his downfall. Elias exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "That was too close," he muttered. Saren didn't say anything, but her eyes met his, and in that brief exchange, Elias saw something he hadn't expected: gratitude. It wasn't just for his help, but for the silent understanding they shared. They were both fighting for something bigger than themselves. They couldn't stop now. The mission was far from over. The control center was only a few meters ahead, its flickering lights casting an eerie glow against the shadows of the rocky landscape. Elias's heart raced as he crouched low beside Saren, both of them hidden behind a large metal crate. They had made it past the guards, their footsteps silent against the cold, uneven ground. The chivalrous attention was elsewhere, on the disruption Saren had caused. But Elias knew they couldn't relax. They had to act quickly. "Once we reach the relay, what do you need me to do?" Elias whispered, glancing at Saren. Saren's face was set in a determined expression. "I'll handle the transmission. You just need to keep an eye out. If anything goes wrong, we need to run." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency in it now. Time was slipping away. Elias nodded, trying to suppress the nerves that threatened to take over. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. There was something more personal about it now. His thoughts briefly returned to the blood he had given her, the very blood of a human soldier coursing through the veins of an enemy. It felt surreal, but in this moment, the mission and the partnership between them mattered more than anything else. They approached the relay building, a small structure surrounded by high walls and security systems. The walls were lined with surveillance cameras, but Saren had already disabled most of them with the disruptor. Only a few remained operational, and the two of them had to be quick. "Stay low," Saren muttered as she crept forward, her steps as light as a shadow. Elias followed, crouching behind her. They reached the outer wall of the control center, where a small access door was barely visible. Saren approached it carefully, her fingers working the control panel with practiced precision. Elias kept watch, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any movement. The only sound was the soft hum of machinery inside the building. After a tense moment, the door clicked open, and Saren slipped inside. Elias followed, his pulse quickening as the door closed silently behind them. They were in. The interior of the relay station was dimly lit, the walls lined with advanced technology that looked alien to Elias. Screens flashed with data, and various consoles blinked with activity. Saren moved toward one of the terminals, her fingers flying over the holographic interface. Elias stood guard near the door, watching for any sign of danger. "Almost there," Saren said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of tension in her tone. "Just need to upload the data." Elias nodded, his eyes flicking nervously between the door and the terminal. He had been trained to stay calm under pressure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet hum of the station seemed louder now, and he couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Suddenly, the door opened, and Elias spun around, his heart stopping in his chest. A chivalrous soldier stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes narrowing as he locked gazes with Elias. "Intruders!" the soldier shouted, his voice cold and commanding. Without thinking, Elias dove toward the soldier, his hand reaching for his rifle. But before he could react, Saren was faster. She leaped forward with surprising speed, her metallic arm flashing as she disarmed the soldier in a swift motion. The soldier staggered back, but Saren was already on top of him, her movements a blur. She kicked the soldier's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The soldier groaned, trying to get back up, but Saren pressed her foot against his chest, keeping him pinned. Her eyes locked with Elias's. "Finish uploading the data," she commanded urgently. Elias didn't hesitate. He rushed to the terminal, his hands shaking as he quickly resumed the upload. The soldier beneath Saren struggled, but he was no match for her strength. Elias knew this would buy them only a few moments, but it was all they needed. The upload bar filled slowly, the seconds ticking by painfully. Elias's mind raced, his thoughts moving at 100 miles per hour. They couldn't stay in the control center for long. The soldier was likely calling for backup, and the alarm would be triggered any second. But there was one thing that felt wrong, something that had been nagging at him since they'd entered the building. "Done," he said, relief washing over him as the data finished uploading to the Shalvaris communication network. But as he turned to Saren, something in her eyes caught his attention. It was a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, a brief, subtle shift in her expression. Before he could speak, the soldier under her foot suddenly smiled. A dark, knowing smile. "It's over," the soldier said, his voice dripping with smugness. Elias's heart dropped into his stomach. "What do you mean it's over?" he demanded, his pulse quickening. Saren stepped back, her face unreadable now. She reached for something in her armor, something that Elias didn't notice until it was too late. The glow of a small hidden device in her hand caught his eye. The soldier had set them up. The moment Saren activated the device, the building's alarm blared to life, the red lights flashing as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Saren looked at Elias, her expression conflicted, torn between duty and betrayal. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elias's mind spun as he realized the truth. Saren had been playing him all along. The data wasn't meant to be shared with humanity. She had used him to gain access to the relay, to deceive him into helping her. The door slammed open, and a group of heavily armed Shalvaris soldiers rushed in. Elias's stomach twisted with the realization that he had been betrayed. And now, they were trapped. The alarm blared around Elias, its shrill sound hammering at his senses. The red lights flashed like a heartbeat, making everything feel like it was closing in on him. Saren, standing still in the middle of the room, looked more like a stranger than the woman he had helped. Elias's mind raced, his thoughts scattered in a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and betrayal. "I'm sorry," Saren had whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarm. But the words felt hollow to him now. It didn't make sense. Why would she do this? Why had she let him believe they were allies, when all along he was just a pawn in her game? Elias's hand instinctively went to his rifle, but he knew it was pointless. The Shalvaris soldiers were closing in, and there were too many of them. He wasn't going to make it out of here alive, not without a fight. But the betrayal from Saren stung deeper than anything else. She had been the only one he'd trusted in this war-torn world. And now she had sold him out. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice thick with disbelief. His eyes locked with hers, searching for any sign of the woman who had shared a bond with him, the woman he had saved. But all he saw was the cold, calculated expression of a soldier, a Shalvaris warrior doing her duty. Saren didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flickered to the soldiers advancing toward them, then back to Elias. Her eyes seemed to soften for a split second, but the hardness quickly returned. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. "This isn't just about us. It never was." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. What wasn't about them? What was she hiding? One of the Shalvaris soldiers, a towering figure with dark green skin and sharp angular features, stepped forward. His voice was commanding and cold. "Saren, step aside. We'll handle this." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her hesitate. For a brief moment, it seemed like she was considering her options. But then, with a resigned sigh, she stepped away from the soldiers she had pinned down earlier. She didn't move to fight them. Instead, she simply watched as the soldiers surrounded Elias. "Take him into custody," the lead soldier ordered. Elias didn't put up a fight. There was no point. His mind was consumed with the questions burning through his thoughts. Why had Saren betrayed him? What had changed? He could hardly believe the woman he had risked his life to save was now the one leading him to his own capture. The soldiers quickly bound his hands with restraining cuffs, their technology holding him in place. Elias didn't resist, but his thoughts were in turmoil. They dragged him to his feet and began to march him toward the door, his mind racing. "Saren," Elias called, his voice desperate. "What the hell is going on?" "You." "Enough," Saren interrupted, her voice firm. "I didn't want this, Elias. You were never supposed to get caught up in this." Her eyes seemed pained, but the resolve in her voice was unshakable. But now it's too late. Elias stared at her, trying to make sense of her words, but his mind was clouded by the shock of the betrayal. He had believed in her. He had believed they were allies, that they were working together for something bigger. And now, all of that had been a lie. "Why didn't you just kill me then?" Elias spat, his voice laced with anger. "Why go through all this? Why let me help you if you were just going to betray me?" Saren didn't respond at first. She looked away, her gaze flickering toward the door. "You don't know everything," she said softly. "I didn't have a choice." Elias's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Before Saren could answer, the lead soldier spoke again, his tone now sharp. "We don't have time for this. Move out." With that, they began to drag Elias out of the control center, his feet stumbling as they forced him forward. He glanced over his shoulder one last time at Saren, his heart heavy with confusion and anger. Her eyes followed him, but she didn't move. There was no sign of the woman he had thought she was. Instead, there was only a soldier, one who had done what she had to do, no matter the cost. As they marched him down the narrow corridors of the station, Elias's mind raced. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what was really going on. There had to be more to this story. Saren's sudden shift in behavior didn't add up. Something was missing, something he hadn't understood. The soldiers pushed him into a holding cell, locking the door with a loud metallic click. The small room was cold and sterile, lit by a harsh white light that made the walls seem even more suffocating. Elias sank to the floor, his back against the cold metal, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. But the one question that refused to leave him was the simplest. Why did she do it? Minutes passed, then hours, but the answers never came. The only sound was the faint hum of machinery outside the cell. Elias tried to push the thoughts from his mind, tried to clear the fog that clouded his judgment, but it was useless. The betrayal stung, and it hurt more than he was willing to admit. As the night stretched on, Elias knew he had to find a way out of this. He couldn't stay locked in this cage forever. But more importantly, he couldn't just walk away from the mystery surrounding Saren. There was something bigger at play here, something he hadn't yet uncovered. And he would find out what it was, no matter the cost. The hours dragged on, and Elias's mind refused to settle. The cold cell, with its bright, sterile light and quiet hum of machinery, felt like a prison for his thoughts as much as his body. His hands were still bound with restraining cuffs, though the tightness had begun to ease with time. He could move his fingers a little now, but there was no escape. Not yet. The questions kept circling in his mind. What had happened? Why had Saren betrayed him? She had been a soldier, yes, but there was something more to her. Elias could feel it. There had been moments when her expression softened, when he caught glimpses of humanity beneath the warrior mask she wore. But now, none of that mattered. She had turned on him, just like every other enemy he'd ever faced. Yet, even now, Elias couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her story than betrayal. Why had she hesitated to join the chivalrous forces fully? Why had she asked for his help, knowing the risks? The confusion gnawed at him, twisting his thoughts into a knot. The door to the cell opened suddenly, and Elias snapped his head up. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't Saren. She stood in the doorway, her figure silhouetted by the harsh light behind her. She didn't seem surprised to see him, nor did she show any emotion as she studied him for a long moment. Elias was silent for a moment, unsure what to say. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice cold. "I didn't expect you to show up." Saren stepped into the room, the door closing behind her with a soft click. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. Her usual armor was gone, replaced by a more casual uniform, though the insignia of her people still adorned her chest. "You should have been more careful," Saren said quietly, her eyes scanning the room, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't want to put you in danger. I didn't want any of this to happen." Elias stared at her, disbelief written across his face. "Then why did you do it? Why set me up? You could have just killed me if you didn't want to get me involved." Saren shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple, Elias. I had no choice. The mission I'm on, it's bigger than just me. It's bigger than you." Elias narrowed his eyes, not entirely buying what she was saying. "What mission? What the hell is going on? You can't just drop this on me and expect me to believe you after what you did." Saren closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if collecting her thoughts. "You're right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have told you everything from the start, but I couldn't. I had orders to bring you in, to make sure you were taken out of the picture." Elias stiffened, anger surging through him. "So that was it. You were using me the whole time. Just a tool to get rid of me." "No," Saren said quickly, her voice firm. She took a step closer to him, her expression softening slightly. "I never wanted that, Elias. You were a complication, but you also became something I didn't expect. I trusted you in ways I shouldn't have." She sighed, lowering her head. "But I couldn't go against my orders." Elias's anger flared, but he couldn't completely push aside the doubt that had begun to creep into his mind. "And what about now?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What do you want from me now, Saren? Why are you here?" Saren hesitated, biting her lip before speaking. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can help you. If you let me." She met his gaze, her eyes serious. "I'm not here to hurt you anymore. I need you to trust me." Elias scoffed. "Trust you? After everything?" "I know it's a lot to ask," she replied, her voice tinged with regret. "But the truth is, I wasn't always a part of this. I was recruited by the chivalrous, but I didn't choose this life. I didn't know what they were truly planning until I was already too deep. I thought I could handle it. But now, everything has changed. The mission. It's bigger than just saving my people. There are forces at play that even the chivalrous didn't expect." Elias felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. "What do you mean?" His voice was steady now, though the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Saren lowered her eyes, looking almost defeated. "The chivalrous are planning to trigger a war that will destroy everything. Not just on my planet, but across the galaxy. They have technology that could tip the balance of power forever. And I was supposed to be a part of it." Elias stared at her, stunned. This was far bigger than he could have imagined. He had thought he was simply caught in the middle of a conflict between two species, but this was something else entirely. "You want me to help you stop them," Elias said slowly, his mind processing what she had just revealed. "Yes," Saren confirmed, her voice low. "I've gathered information, but I can't do this alone. I need your help. We need to work together." Elias's mind raced. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, a part of him still wanted to believe her. The thought of an even greater threat, one that could consume everything, was too dangerous to ignore. He exhaled sharply, still struggling to come to terms with everything he had learned. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with caution. "But if you're lying to me—" "I'm not," Saren interrupted, her eyes locking with his. "I swear." Elias stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we have a deal." It was a fragile alliance, born of necessity and the need for survival. But in this uncertain world, it was the only chance they had left, and Elias was willing to take it, no matter the cost. "Cover me," Saren called, her voice sharp with urgency. Elias moved into position, taking cover behind a large piece of equipment. He could hear the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. Reinforcements were on the way. They didn't have much time. He could see Saren working quickly at the console, her fingers flying over the controls. But as much as he wanted to trust her, Elias knew that things could still go wrong. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Elias peeked around his cover, spotting a group of Shalvaris soldiers rushing toward them. His heart pounded in his chest as he squeezed the trigger, sending shots in their direction. The soldiers returned fire, and the air was filled with the sharp sound of blaster shots. "Just a little longer," Saren shouted, her voice strained. Elias fought to keep his focus, his every muscle tense as he fired, ducking behind cover whenever the enemy returned fire. The room felt smaller with each passing second, and the weight of their mission pressed down on him. They had to stop the Nexus relay. They couldn't let the Shalvaris win. Finally, with a soft peep, the console in front of Saren flashed green. "Done," she shouted. Elias immediately turned his attention back to the soldiers. "We need to move," he called, waving for Saren to follow him. But as he turned to make their escape, something caught his eye, a large red light flashing above the central structure. The system was beginning to reboot. The Nexus relay hadn't been fully disabled. "No," Elias yelled, rushing toward the machine. He could see the countdown ticking down on a nearby screen. The Shalvaris were moments away from activating the relay, and if they succeeded, it would be too late. Saren reached him just as the countdown reached 0. She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the machine. "It's too late," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I tried." Elias felt his heart sink. No, we can still stop it." But as the lights in the room flickered and the sound of the activation filled the air, Elias realized the truth. They had failed. As the countdown ended, a pulse of energy shot from the machine, sending a shockwave through the room. Elias could feel the air shift, the weight of failure pressing down on him. The Shalvaris had won. But as the dust settled and the silence filled the room, Elias didn't give up. He couldn't. He looked at Saren, their eyes meeting for the first time since everything had started. "We're not done," he said quietly. "We'll find another way. We'll stop them. Together." Saren nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. The fight wasn't over yet, and no matter what it took, they would keep fighting. Until the very end. The software of the ship's engines filled the small cockpit as Saren and Elias sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the starry expanse outside. The darkness of space was endless, but there was something comforting about the quiet hum of the ship beneath them. Yet, despite the calm surroundings, Elias felt anything but at peace. His thoughts were still consumed with the revelations from earlier, the truth about the Shalvaris and Saren's role in their plans. It was hard to trust her after everything, but Elias knew there was no turning back now. She had revealed that the Shalvaris were planning something much worse than just a war. The technology they had was powerful enough to rewrite the balance of power in the galaxy, and if they succeeded, it would mean the end for everyone, humans and aliens alike. Elias had agreed to work with Saren, but doubts lingered in the back of his mind. Could he really trust her? After everything that had happened, could he believe she was truly on his side now? "Do you know where we're going?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the silence. He turned his gaze from the stars to Saren, who was focused on the ship's controls. Saren nodded, but didn't immediately answer. Her eyes flickered to the readouts on the console before she spoke. We're heading to a hidden base on the outskirts of the Shalvaris-controlled territories. It's the only place where we can access the full scope of their plans. We need to find the source of their power, how they're planning to use this new technology. Elias glanced at her, still trying to understand her motives. And you trust these people? Whoever they are, they're part of the Shalvaris, right? You can't just switch sides overnight. Saren's jaw tightened at his words. It's not that simple, Elias. You don't know what it's like, being caught between two worlds. I wasn't given a choice in all of this. The Shalvaris, they have my people under their control. If I didn't follow their orders, my family would be in danger. But I never agreed with their methods, not from the beginning. Elias remained silent, trying to piece together her story. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict that had led to her betraying him. Yet she was helping him now. Maybe that was enough for the time being. The stakes were too high to let personal grudges get in the way. All right, he said finally, his voice steady. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart. We need to plan. We can't just rush in and hope for the best. Saren looked over at him, her expression serious. I agree. That's why we need the data I've been gathering. The Shalvaris have been developing a device, something that could give them control over entire star systems. It's called the Nexus Relay. If they activate it, they could destabilize entire planetary systems. It could create chaos on a galactic scale. Elias's stomach dropped at the thought. That sounds worse than a war. It is, Saren said quietly. That's why we have to stop them before it's too late. The tension in the air was thick as they flew through the endless stretch of space. Elias couldn't help but wonder if there were other forces at play here, if there were things Saren wasn't telling him. She had been part of the Shalvaris for so long. How could he be sure that she wasn't still loyal to them in some way? Are you sure we can trust your source? Elias asked, his voice skeptical. Saren's expression hardened. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in this. I trust them more than I trust the Shalvaris. And that's saying something. As the hours passed, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were too many variables, too many unknowns in this plan. He was used to fighting wars, used to following orders. But this was different. He was now in the middle of a dangerous game, and he couldn't fully trust his partner, no matter how much he wanted to. Eventually, the ship broke through the atmosphere of a distant, desolate planet. The landscape below was barren, the surface dotted with craters and the remains of old structures. This was the place, the hidden base where Saren had said they could find the answers they needed. The ship descended slowly, its engines humming softly as it touched down on the cracked ground. The planet was silent, the only sound the low growl of the ship's landing gear as it settled into place. We're here, Saren said quietly, unstrapping herself from her seat. Stay sharp. We don't know what kind of security they have here. Elias nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle as he followed Saren out of the ship. The air was thin and dry, the heat from the sun bearing down on them as they stepped onto the surface. The ruins around them seemed to whisper of forgotten battles, lost history, and secrets buried deep within the dust. As they moved forward, Elias kept his eyes on their surroundings, his every sense alert for danger. He didn't trust this place, didn't trust the Shalvaris, and certainly didn't trust Saren fully. But this was their only chance. They had to succeed. There was no other way. They approached an entrance to a large underground facility, its massive doors covered in layers of ancient rusted metal. Saren pressed a button on her wrist, and the door slowly began to open with a creak of old machinery. "Ready?" she asked, her voice low. Elias didn't reply immediately. He could hear his own heartbeat thumping in his ears, the silence of the planet pressing in on him. But then he nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Let's do this." They stepped inside, entering the dark, forgotten halls of the Shalvaris secrets. The walls were lined with strange symbols and unfamiliar technology, and the air was thick with the weight of history. This was the heart of their enemy's power, and Elias knew that inside these walls lay the answers they desperately needed. But it was also where the greatest danger awaited them. Elias's boots echoed softly against the cold concrete floor as he followed Siren deeper into the heart of the Shalvarus underground base. The dim light from the flickering overhead panels cast long shadows across the walls, making everything feel more ominous. The air smelled stale, heavy with dust and the remnants of long-forgotten experiments. Every step they took seemed to lead them further into the unknown, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "How much further?" Elias asked, his voice low as he kept his eyes scanning their surroundings. His hand never strayed far from his weapon, ready for any surprise attack. Siren didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze focused on the path ahead. "We're almost there," she said at last, her tone steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. "The control room is just up ahead." Elias nodded, trying to push his doubts to the back of his mind. He trusted Siren, or at least he wanted to. But after everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. They turned a corner, and the sight of a massive door loomed before them. The door was made of reinforced metal, with strange symbols glowing faintly along its surface. This was it, the heart of the Shalvarus operation, the place where the Nexus relay was being kept. Elias felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing as the reality of what they were about to face hit him all at once. "Stay alert," Siren warned, her voice a whisper now. "Once we go in, we don't have much time before the security systems activate." Elias glanced at her, then back at the door. His grip on his weapon tightened. "We'll make it work. We have to." Siren nodded and stepped forward, placing her hand on a panel next to the door. She worked quickly, her fingers moving with practiced speed as she input a series of commands. The symbols on the door flickered for a moment, then the heavy metal slid open with a groan, revealing a large, high-tech control room beyond. Inside, the walls were lined with holographic displays and blinking consoles, each one showing data streams and images Elias couldn't make sense of. In the center of the room, a large metallic structure stood, its purpose unclear but ominous. This was where the Shalvarus were building their weapon, the technology that could change the fate of the galaxy. "That's it," Siren said, her voice low and tense. She motioned toward the central structure, where several Shalvarus scientists were working. "We need to disable the Nexus relay before they can activate it." Before Elias could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Siren's eyes widened with alarm. "They've found us." Elias's heart raced. They didn't have much time now. They had to act fast. "How do we disable it?" he demanded, his eyes darting to the scientists who had just turned toward them, their expressions filled with surprise and fear. Siren's gaze flickered to a console at the far side of the room. "There. I can override the system, but it'll take a few minutes. We need to hold them off until then." Without waiting for a response, Siren dashed toward the console, her movements quick and precise. Elias followed her, his rifle at the ready. The Shalvarus scientists seemed confused at first, but as soon as they saw the weapons in their hands, they scrambled to take cover.